Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. Um, Dave, Jinks, and I, my co-host, we have had ongoing discussions about NDEs, near-death experiences. And so we've been looking for a guest to come on and talk about that. And I think we found the perfect guest to do that today. Before we get to our guest, though, I have to share a story, Dave,
Mhm.
about a personal experience of mine that wasn't near death, but I think it kind of speaks to what talking about this phenomenon leads to. So I've had several surgeries on my foot, as you know, and the last time I was in the hospital to have a surgery, they sent in the anesthesiologist. I guess that's what they call him, the person that's going to come in and tell you what's going to happen before you have surgery. So I thought, this guy, is a doctor. I'm going to find out what he thinks about NDEs. So I said, Dr. So-and-so, I'm just curious. This doesn't have anything to do with what's going to happen to me, but how do you feel about NDEs, near-death experiences? And there was this kind of profound, elongated silence. And I don't know what was going on in his mind, but I kind of think if I could have uh, supplied the uh, the comments internally, it would have been something like, "What a stupid question!" Because here's what he said to me. Well, he said, "There's no such thing as a near-death experience. You're either dead or not dead." So I took it from that answer that he wasn't on the same page that we are. So
Right.
yeah. Anyway, I want to welcome Donna Seebo to our show today. Donna is going to have a whole lot to share with us about this topic, and we may be able to get to meet Donna in person at a coming up IONS meeting here in Thurston County. So, Donna, welcome to our show.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, we're the ones who are delighted that you're here. So why don't you tell us? And I've read some of your bio, but why don't you share with the audience your professional background and how that might um, prepare you or qualify you to be able to talk about near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences? Would you take some time to do that?
Oh, I would be happy to do that. First of all, I've been involved in the work of mind for most of my life, and I'm a mental practitioner, a psychic, whatever term people might want to use the term intuitive, but I'm also a professional broadcaster. And I have just this year celebrated my 21st anniversary for my daily show, the Donna Seebo Show, which is on Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 p.m. Pacific time. And all people have to do is just Google my name and they can find the link. And then there is also the aspect of speaking and working as a counselor, as a minister. And when it comes to the subject matter, which I'm sure we're going to include a number of different things, but when it comes to talking about near-death experiences, it's not something that I ever felt was, how do I want to say this? Unusual. I think it's much more common than what people have typically discussed because culturally, depending on what culture you come from, those near death experiences you may not share with but just a handful of people, if anyone. And then if you have a cultural background, let's say like the Chinese background, or you have the East Indian background, Native American background, there's so many different cultures around the world that are so comfortable with this. This is not something that when you bring it up, they go, oh, please don't share it with me. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
They go, tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me what it was like. What did you see? Do you remember? Now, the thing about near-death experiences is that sometimes they're very much like out-of-body experiences that people have. The near-death experiences in my conversations with thousands of people over the many years that I've been engaged in the work, it is something that sometimes they wonder if they actually died when it was really an out of body experience. So frequently, what we're hearing today are publications that people are on tour about, and they are sharing publicly these experiences that they have gone through. And of course, you mentioned the IANS meeting, which here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's an international organization, anybody can check on this. But in Seattle, they have hundreds of people that come out to their meetings. Here in the Lacey area, which is more convenient for me and people like you that are in the southern area of Washington, this is just relatively new. They just started this up in 2019, and then it went on hiatus because of COVID. But my experience has been often just to be open with people. And when you interview the various individuals like I do, so often when you're off microphone, they may add little stories that for some reason they feel uncomfortable about sharing on air, which I have respect for that. But there's this openness, Daniel, that I think is so very exceptional today. And a lot of nurses, they witness
Hmm.
near-death
Right.
experiences frequently. Family members, witness things many times, and they can't explain them. There's all kinds of items that go on. So when you look at this, and when you have the opportunity to sit with someone and listen to their story, it's change. I mean, it changes your thinking, it changes your life. And I'm thrilled with it because it takes a lot of fear away, which I think is so important. My goodness, we're just being swallowed up by fear at this time.
Yeah.
And it's a paralysis that really can mess up our lives pretty intensely. Did I
So
answer your question?
you did, but the problem with me is once you answer one question, I've got more
Oh,
questions.
good.
Um,
Good.
so how would you differentiate an OBE from an NDE? Would it be in an OBE you can will that to happen, whereas an NDE you don't necessarily will that? Well, I'm answering the question I'm asking you, so let's let you answer.
Well, the out of body experience, I'll share a story with you. One of my clients, and this was a number of years ago, her name was Sandy. And she was having a consultation with me, and she said, Donna, I've got to ask you about something. I just don't understand what's going on. And she had small children at the time. And like most mothers, if you hear any sounds or something's just not right, your radar is up. And so you go, I've got to go check on this right away. And what happened is she got up out of bed. She goes and she's checking on her kids, and everything's fine. She turns around because the light in the children's bedroom had been left on. The kids hadn't turned it off, and they were sound asleep. So she goes and she reaches for the light switch, and her hand goes through the wall. And she goes, that's weird. She's fully conscious. She's operating in a normal way. She has this experience, and I had to smile. And she said, Donna, then I'm walking down the hall. And she said, all of a sudden, I said, oh my goodness, this scares me to death. And she felt herself go pop right back into her body.
Hmm.
And I told her, I said, it's an out of body experience. Whereas with a near death experience, they are very close in the way the body operates. Because when you have a near death experience, you actually are out of the body. You are able to observe sometimes everything that's going on. There is a nurse practitioner that was very skilled as a healer that I met years ago. And she related a particular experience she had. There was an individual that was being prepared for surgery, and she was known for her healing talents. And so what occurred is she would have a bag packed there. If she got a call in the middle of the night from one of the doctors that had worked with her for a number of years, she would be ready to go to the hospital. She could do a change a dress in like 5 minutes. It would be that fast. And she'd be down at the hospital. Well, this was a situation where it was a very critical surgery, very critical surgery. The person could die on the table. And she ended up getting this call from this surgeon in advance of the surgery, asking her if she would come in and be present and do the meditation. He said, I don't know what you do. I just know I've got a very critical case here and I need a little, as much help as I can get. And he said, you've been recommended by other doctors. So he was totally skeptical about the whole thing. So sure enough, she gets a call. He's got a very early morning surgery. He wants to take care of this person, first patient of the day. He goes into the hospital. She goes into the hospital after she gets the call. He says, okay, you need to scrub up. You're going to be in garb. And she said, I know the routine. She goes through. He said, I don't want you to say a word. I want you to stand over there in that corner. And whatever it is that you do, you use your mojo. That's it. She said, fine. So that's what she did. The surgery took quite a long time. She stood in the corner and she did her process that she did for healing. And that was when it was all over. A few hours later, she leaves and he says, thank you very much. She said, not a problem. She goes home, goes to bed because she's just exhausted. He called her the next day, and it was later in the day because the patient had come out from under anesthesia. And he said, I want you to come to the hospital, please. She said, oh, is everything okay? He said, everything's fine. Please come to the hospital, meet me at a certain location. And that's all he'd say. She said, I can be there in 15 minutes. She goes to the hospital and he's waiting for her. He said, come on, we're going to go to the intensive care unit. That's where the patient is. Now, so they get there. Before they entered the room of the patient that had been operated on earlier that morning, he said to her, he said, you are not to say one word. You are to just walk into the room, be quiet, and stand over in a corner. She always got put in a corner. Anyway, she does exactly what he says. The patient in that room, and he'd come very close to not making it. It was such a critical surgery. The patient in that room saw her. He said, that's the woman that was standing in the corner of the operating room. And the doctor, she didn't say a word. The doctor said, describe to me. So he told the doctor what he and the other surgeons were saying. He said, this is what the woman was doing. She was sending me healing. I could hear her prayers. And he had described everything. Now, she had been totally covered from head to toe with surgical garb. Gloves, there was nothing visible. She kept her eyes closed the whole time, going into a meditative state while she was in that room. And this man described everything. After he did, the doctor had a little bit of a conversation. He introduced her to the patient, and the patient thanked her for being there. And then he talked to her later on, saying, I have never in all my years of being a physician had a patient that was so close to death come back and have all of this information. I can't explain it. And she said, oh, I understand totally. So you can imagine the physician was really given an awareness. But nurses hear and see so much. But this isn't the only story that I've heard through the years. And I've done a number of interviews, and nurses especially are very much aware because they're dealing with people all the time. The out of body, he was close to death. He could have died on that operating table. This was extremely critical. So he was out of the body, but he stayed close enough to the body where he was able, he just pulled in all of this detail all around him, fully conscious. Some people that have near-death experiences don't have that. They're not in that level. They instead are moving very quickly into maybe another environment. There's all kinds of descriptions that people have. You know, it's not like you have this little encapsulated, this is the way it's supposed to be, and this is the way it's not supposed to be. It's a very personal experience. And as a friend of mine that's had two near-death experiences and other people that I've talked to, she said, you come back changed. You never stay the same because it makes you aware of what's going on. I just had a conversation yesterday with, an individual that was talking to someone that had had a near-death experience. And my friend was saying, well, you came back. What changed when you came back? And this person said, I didn't see a white light. I didn't see a tunnel. I didn't see any of this that so many people experience. But what I became aware of when I came back is that I needed to stop walking around with my head in the clouds, that I needed to pay attention to what was going on around me. Apparently, she had had a patterning for all of her life where everything was just hunky-dory. It was like Disneyland every single day. And life isn't. It's nice, but you think about it, after a while, it's not the real thing. Life has a lot of different shifts and changes in it. And she just came back with an awareness about life. And my friend told her, that was your gift. Because everyone my friend talked with said, including herself, that every person comes back changed. They come back with maybe skills and talents. And it's marvelous. I mean, it's great, but it gives all of us an understanding that there's so much more in this expression of life than most of us are ever taught.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. Have you had a near-death experience?
No, I haven't. But like just about everybody on this planet, and I say everybody, all of us go through out-of-body experiences. And I've had those experiences, but I have not chosen to do it at will. People can learn to do it at will. I haven't chosen to do that. It seems like I'm kept busy enough at night that I don't need to work on it willfully. And it's one of those things that I don't know. I think when you start getting into the studying of the mind and the spirit,
Mhm.
and you get into different cultural understandings and have, as I've been blessed to have, all of these wonderful people that you come in contact with that share their knowledge, their wisdoms, whatever they might be, and you just listen, you realize that there is so much to life that we just often discard. It's wonderful, I think.
Mhm. I did a presentation not too long ago at the Lacey Library on ghosts and hauntings. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was the fact that if you want to understand that phenomena, you have to understand human consciousness. And an interesting question to me, and I'm interested in your answer, is in the past, we've kind of conflated the human mind and consciousness as being the same thing. I don't think it is. So where is human consciousness located if it's not located in your brain? If those two things aren't synonymous.
You've presented a very interesting question because there could be perhaps more than one way to look at it. But let me share with you my particular perspective. Consciousness, which I would define as universal. It is unlimited. It is always exploring. It records every single essence of every single experience that is known, lived through by every form of life, period. That's my interpretation. The human consciousness has a connection with what we call the universal consciousness. That's the word we use. It's very difficult, I think, because again, as human beings, we like to encapsulate things with little labels, little titles. This is box A, this is box B. Whereas with consciousness, it doesn't have any limitations. And it always is in its expansion. It is there. It doesn't have any judgments. It's there and it's all encompassing. And we just don't have any way of wrapping our minds about it. As individuals, we have, I will say, the brain, which is very much like a computer, and it processes information. And that brain activity is only able to work to the capacity that we're willing to operate it. It's like we've got a whole bunch of software to work with, and we have to learn how to use it. So our human consciousness relates to our experience, but yet we're linked with the universal consciousness. There's really no separation, but we all have our universe, our own particular experiences that we go through. So you might have an experience that would perhaps take you psychically, I'll use that terminology, take you psychically to a situation that's going on over in Nepal. And you are in that experience. You have, let's call it maybe an out-of-body experience, but you're there, you're talking with people, you have all of this that's going on. That's your experience. I don't have that experience in Nepal. You have, and by sharing it or integrating it in some way, maybe in a story form, well, however you choose to do it, but it affects you. That goes in to the universal consciousness, and you're adding to that stockpile, which is unbelievably huge. But every time you share your experience with someone, there may be a person that comes up and said, you had that experience. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad I'm not going crazy, because I was in South America and this is what I saw. And then something happened a short time later and I was in this time and space and I can't explain it. Or we will get, I like to call them downloads. And I'm fascinated with this. I have been fascinated with this ever since the woman who was my mentor shared with me the understanding, which I didn't have much of, I have to be very honest, shared with me the understanding that I had these skills of mind that I was going to be using for most of my life, which I still use today and I use with clients. There are times we get downloads of information that we just have no clue where it's come from. We don't know. It's not in our knowledge. We didn't go to college to study it, but there it is. And you find with scientists like Tesla and Einstein and, so many others, they will often say, I don't know how I got this information, but I got it and it works. It's fascinating. So in a sense, it's separate, but in another sense, it's not, because we have this link with this massive amount of information that the human mind can't even begin to comprehend. We can't. We have a hard enough time just dealing with having to scramble eggs in the morning. I mean, just get real here. And if you deal with emails, you're ready to have, a coffee break within 15 minutes because you've got hundreds sitting in your box from God knows where. It's just life. So each of us are contributors. Each of us are very significant. And that is what I just love about being engaged in the work of mind, because it doesn't have any discrimination whatsoever. Male, female, doesn't make any difference. And it can demonstrate itself in such amazing ways. And I've seen it even with people that call themselves skeptics. They don't realize what's going on. And because they're not aware, or they become intimidated, they become afraid. And we have to learn how to work with these experiences. And that's why I think, again, anyone in the medical field, especially the nurses, they have a very close connection to this. That's why so many of them have gone into energy healing. They take classes on this that are certified today. I know a woman that she passed away a few years ago. Her name is Dorothea Kramer. And she actually developed, she was a very gifted woman. I had the privilege of having her as a speaker at the Northwest Women's Show, and having her as a guest on my show more than once. This was an incredibly brilliant woman, but she developed this energy training healing for nurses, and it's accredited. It goes into it. So nurses are many times doing energy work with their patients, and you don't have to say anything to anybody. And they're doing it because they say, we want to help. It's one of the reasons why they become nurses, because that's important to them. So I know I've digressed and I've bounced around a little bit, but I hope I've answered your question.
Well, I have something that that I want to get in here because you did touch on a subject which is fascinating to me, and that is the idea of the so-called Akashic record, the Akashic record, which is something that I think makes such perfect sense when you're trying to kind of wrap your wrap your brain around all this. Where is consciousness? That was Dan's question: is where does consciousness reside? You know, science in general, at least Western science, still somehow insists that consciousness is contained exclusively in the brain. I think those ideas are changing, maybe a little bit, morphing barely. I mean, at a snail's pace, it seems like, to those of us who are really wanting to get on with the conversation and expand to the point where it really should be, I think, at this point. But the idea, again, all these subjects that Dan and I talk about with fascinating guests, we kind of try to summarize what their different viewpoints are and come up to conclusions. I know that it's hard to come to conclusions with a lot of this stuff because it just is ever evolving. But one of the best analogies that I've heard and that I can think of is the idea that the human brain is like a TV receiver. It's like the situation where you bring an Aboriginal into your living room and you say, okay, look at that TV, tell me what those people, and maybe they're watching a soccer game or something, and the Aboriginal thinks, oh my God, how did you get those little people in there? You know, they're kicking around the ball in that box. That's impossible. Well, the obvious answer is that the TV is just receiving a signal and portraying it on the screen, not that everything exists within that wooden box, or these days the the flat screen. So that analogy to me makes the most sense to everyone. Everyone can relate to that sort of difference between, does it reside in the head or is it simply a signal coming in that the brain interprets? And I think that's basically what you were saying, and I think that's the really logical conclusion. But the idea of this Akashic record, this vast library of every human and other experience, is somehow cataloged and contained in this matrix, so to speak, this multi-dimensional matrix. Can you talk a little bit about that idea of this vast library, which can be accessed? I mean, maybe you have your library card, maybe you can earn different levels of library card. Maybe it's a little more complicated than the Dewey Decimal System, which the three of us remember, but I would bet that a lot of our younger listeners probably don't have any idea who or what Dewey Decimal was. But can you talk about that a little bit, as that concept at least?
Well, I think it's good you brought up the terminology, because I think it's very compatible with what I call the universal mind. And the Akashic records are very, very real. This is something that people have in ancient cultures used different terms for, and it is very real. And I think it's phenomenal, and people can train themselves to have access. But we've got such busy minds that, and in today's world especially, how many people are going to be willing to do the disciplines to get there?
Right.
Not likely. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what do I really want to know? And dependent, and this is going to sound a little bit boxed in, but dependent on your education and your vocabulary. What's so amazing about the Akashic records, the universal mind, is that it works with anybody on their individual level. And I like to say to people, it's very important, once you start exploring, to realize you've got to keep an open mind. You need to ask yourself, what are your filters? If something is intimidating to you in any way, shape, or form, when, let's say, you want to find out about the Akashic records, well, a lot of people are really nosy and they want to stick their nose into things that they shouldn't. So there is some kind of I'll call it a paradigm, a boundary that exists, just like you would have with a 5-year-old when they start going and climbing up into the cupboards and saying, I want to know what you got here, and start tossing everything out. You say, excuse me, but that's not acceptable behavior. We're not going to deal with that. So this is something that confuses people. There is a patterning that once you begin your exploration into the powers of the mind, into healing, into the Akashic records, I don't care what modality you go into, it's as if you have to become educated. You have to learn the language. You have to understand how your mind works. I've been telling this to people for well over 40 years. When you would, let's say, get a download from the Akashic records, you have to work with that so you can understand it. It has been my experience personally, as well as professionally, that every person's mind has its own particular formatting, using the lingo of computers. It has its formatting, and you have to work with that. When I've done seminars and my programs, typically, it's not about me at all. It's about letting people see in a safe environment the capabilities they have. And it's so much fun because they go, I didn't know I could do this. I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I could do blah, blah, blah. And it's wonderful because they're in an environment where they're not putting up a block saying, this is bad, this is good. They're not doing that because I'm not there to judge them. I'm there to introduce them to the awareness that they already inherently have. And in the Western culture, we are bringing in a lot of this thinking that other cultures have known for tens of thousands, if not millions of years. So we're growing up into that awareness. And it's just delightful to see that people come to know this is normal and this is natural. This is not something that's abnormal that only a few people have. That's not the case at all. Not the case at all. But there are those that have different skill sets, those that have different capabilities, different talents. So when you are wanting to explore the Akashic records specifically, believe me, it may take you a while before you're able to do it. And then you have to ask yourself why you want to do it. And if you don't have a clear intention, they may never open up the door, even if you've gotten yourself a pretty library card. They may not do that because they go, why are we going to let you into the library when you can't even sit still for 5 minutes? See, so there's a lot of what I want to say paradigms to deal with, but I think it's fascinating. And there are some people that will make the statement, this is what they do. And I've done interviews with different people in different parts of the world that this is something that is their primary interest. And so they have focused on that. But you know what? It's taken them years. And if you say that to a young person today, they'll go, what do you mean? You don't get it in 30 seconds? I don't have a pill I can swallow? I can't text it? Wait a minute, I want to tweet. I'm sorry. The tweeting is not going to work. There's a responsibility that comes with learning. And I remember one of my mentors, his name was Reverend Humble, and he was a trance medium. This was a gentleman that was born in the late 1800s. He was elderly when I met him, fabulous guy, over 6 feet tall, built like, a defense person on a football team. And he just had this presence. He was a no-nonsense guy. And he would tell people, you need to educate yourself. You need to realize that if you want to develop the skills of the mind or of healing or anything else, you're going to have to work at it. It's not something that's just going to be given to you. Because even if you have the talents, if you don't discipline those talents, they're never going to mean anything. It's like someone that has a magnificent singing voice, and that person just sings, and people just say, "Oh, your voice is wonderful." But they're never going to become a professional because they're not willing, one, to practice, two, to learn the disciplines necessary of working with an orchestra or with different types of environments, taking care of themselves physically. I've known people like this, and it can be in any one array of talents. If you don't work with it, to refine it, to demonstrate it, to put it to use, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So along those lines, because you're opening up so many interesting avenues here to pursue. Well, first thing I want to say is that to me, the Akashic record is such a neat theory, such an elegant model, because it seems to explain so much. Like when you ask, why do some people's lives seem to be uneventful? Why do people live boring lives? Why do children die at the age of 1 year old? Why do mosquitoes exist? Why do things that seem very insignificant? But also on the other end of the spectrum is, why do we have evil dictators? Why did Adolf Hitler exist? I mean, he was evil. What good can that be to a universe? Is the universe evil? Well, the answer is that the universe allows everything along this infinite spectrum. And if to have a complete library, you would put the most boring book ever written in it. And you would also put the biggest textbook that's, 2,000 pages and the most complicated, profound thing you could ever try to wrap your brain around. So it answers the question of, what's the point of some of these aspects of life that give us pause and give us, consternation? We worry about, how can that be allowed in this universe? How would God allow that to happen? Well, the answer is that God wants to fill the library so that future generations and those who've earned the right and who have the library card, or the classification, maybe is an even better term if you're looking at sort of intelligence agency or government levels. If you have the credentials, you can tap into it. So the question I wanted to ask you, Donna, is, you mentioned download. Sometimes you get a periodic download. And I'm wondering, what do you think prompts the download? Is there a specific situation? Do you kind of, to use the video game terminology, do you level up and earn the reward and you receive it? Is it serendipity? Is it random? I mean, when do you get this download? What kind of conditions do you think have to happen before you get that?
Actually, the condition is a very simple one. I just do it. It's not, I don't need a tool. This is something that surprises a lot of people. In many programs that I've done, in fact, with IANS, I did it at the last IANS meeting, which was in January, and I did a blindfold demonstration. Now, this is what it was. Every person that came into the meeting was given a ticket. And you've seen tickets, where they have double tickets. So one ticket goes into a bowl and the other one goes to the person, right? Mm-hmm. All right, that's what I sometimes will do. So I have no idea who gets what ticket, what number they have. I then have someone else, when I put the blindfold on, they will draw one of the tickets at random. When they draw that ticket, they call out the number to me. When they call out the number, I start getting information. Now I have a blindfold on. I cannot see anybody's reaction. Of course, in January, a lot of people were wearing a mask, so you couldn't see anything anyway. And then you have the number that's given, and it doesn't make any difference. They just give me the number off the ticket. I give information to that individual, whoever it's related to, who I have no idea it is. And then I do this with one person right after the other. Let's say I do 10 of them. So we have 10 people in the audience that have received information specifically related to a ticket that was drawn by someone that, you know, a lot of people would say, well, that would interfere with the ticket, that person's energy, blah, 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 so on and so forth. I still get information. And I get specific information. It could be related to health. It could be related to something that I'm seeing that is going to affect them in one way or another. That it's a fascinating thing. And I do it because I don't know how it works. All I know is that I allow myself to be a receiver of information. Now, it is not logical. It is not logical. I have had people come up to me and say, it's not possible. I don't understand how you can do this. And then afterwards, the number will be called out. That was one of the numbers that was called. And then the person will relate to what I am saying. And most of the time, they will say, you said this, it makes sense to me. You said that, it makes sense to me. And it's fascinating. Where does that come from? All I can tell you is that the mind connection is so unlimited. Again, we try to compartmentalize everything. We try to say that something is impossible. Think of the people that worked for the CIA, and Russell Targ is a great example of this. He had people in isolated areas. There was a Officer Parker. He was chief of police. That this man's remote viewing skills enabled him, I think he was with the Highway Patrol in California, when he could find people. He would know what they were guilty of, where he could catch them. I mean, this was something that came with him. I'm aware of, and this was quite a ways back, but 2 officers in New York City that were so empathetic. They could be in 2 areas of New York, or even be out of state, whatever. But typically, if they were in New York and there was something going down by the Hotel Pennsylvania, which is right across the street from Madison Square Garden, something was going down, the one would call the other. They both got the same information that something was going down, and they'd be in the same place at the same time. They caught so many criminals that the people, the upper echelon of the New York Police Department said, this is not good. So they sent one officer off to another location so they couldn't work together anymore. But they were catching criminals before they actually were in the positioning of completing something that they were doing. So what I do when I do the blindfold demonstrations, and I did it via Zoom last December. With people, I didn't even see their faces. I mean, you just don't know, and that's important. But it's fascinating how we have access to this. And a lot of people, and men are especially good at this, they will develop a regimen, and it's the way the male mind works. And I believe it was Edison that would take a nap, and he made sure that he had something like a spoon that was next to him. And he'd go into what that would be called like a twilight stage, where you're sort of awake, you're sort of asleep. And he was getting downloads of information. And many different people will do this. They will train themselves to be in that positioning where, again, it's like a twilight zone. You're awake, but you're not awake. And it's a very significant space to be in because you're not thinking, you're not trying to process anything. You are an open conduit for downloads, and it comes in. Now, I do this consciously. The people that did remote viewing were doing something similar because they could draw things out. And Parker, the officer, he's dead now, just a phenomenally talented man. And he would draw out information so accurately, people said it's not possible. He has to be cheating. He's not cheating. He's stuck in a booth somewhere that not even God could get to him unless he had a special connection. I mean, really, it is amazing that this has been demonstrated so many times. And let me give you an example of a time. And this is with a native woman that I met up in Anchorage, Alaska.